Hey everybody, this is Dr. A, and in this video lesson we've got an opportunity to talk about our next content topic, which is protein and lipid metabolism. And of course, last time we had an opportunity to talk about carbohydrate metabolism, and we will touch base on that again here in this particular video. But again, our focus is going to be on protein and lipid metabolism. Now, as we get started, there are a couple of things that I'd like to refresh your memory about. And the first thing is that we talked about during our discussion on digestion and nutrition, we talked about macronutrients and, of course, micronutrients. And you'll remember that our macronutrients include things that are at the top of this list on the left-hand side of the screen. We've got our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats. Now, here's what's unique and important about these. These three, again, our carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, they have to be chemically digested by the body in order for us to gain the nutrients from those particular food groups. So let's make a note of that. Again, these three have to be chemically digested first. And so you may be wondering, okay, well, what does that mean again? Well, remember, through the process of digestion, we first are going to have ingestion, meaning we're putting food into the mouth. After we've got the process of ingestion that's taken place, then we're going to have mechanical digestion. And mechanical digestion is essentially us using our teeth to cut and to grind our food into smaller pieces. Now, after we've done that, after we've gotten our mechanical digestion, then the chemical digestion takes place, which begins with the addition of saliva to our actual food. And so again, we're saying that in order for our body to gain the nutrients from these food groups, we've got to go through chemical digestion first. Now, that process is not required when it comes to our bodies benefiting from the inclusion of vitamins, minerals, and water into our diet. Again, these are our micronutrients, and of course, those at the top were our macronutrients. Now, another thing that we had an opportunity to talk about was the neuroendocrine system a little while back. And hopefully you'll remember that we said that those two systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, often work together in tandem. And we also said that they are responsible for everything that takes place in the body. And that's accurate. It is responsible for everything. But there are two things that I'd like us to focus on today that will really give us some greater insight into what we're discussing. And the first thing is that the neuroendocrine system is responsible for the processes of digestion. And in addition to that, the neuroendocrine system is responsible for the regulation of something that we refer to as blood glucose levels. And it's this last component here, our blood glucose levels, that I really want us to delve into for just a moment. Now, as we talk about this, the regulation of blood glucose requires at least 5 endocrine glands, which would be the pancreatic islets. We'll talk about those in just a second. The anterior pituitary gland, the adrenal cortex, the adrenal medulla, the thyroid gland, and at least 8 hormones that are secreted by these glands. Now, we're going to start with the pancreas here. And just a little while ago, we saw this term called pancreatic islets. These are cells within the pancreas. So we're going to look at those here more in depth in just a second. So as we look at the pancreas, there are 2 hormones that are probably most popular, if you will. One we know is insulin. It's very popular. And another is glucagon. Now, let's start with glucagon. Glucagon is released from the alpha cells of the pancreas. So, let's make a note of that here on this image. Again, our alpha cells are responsible for the release of glucagon. And let's talk about what glucagon does. Its job is to supply the body with glucose when glucose levels are low. So again, that's the function of glucagon. Now, let's take a look at the beta cells. The beta cells, which are listed here, they are responsible for the release or the secretion of perhaps the most popular hormone of the pancreas, which is insulin. Now, insulin's role or its function is to take glucose in the bloodstream and transport it into our cells so that we can gain the addition of energy for the body, which of course would be ATP. So again, those are the top two hormones of the pancreas. But there are others that we also need to become knowledgeable about. And one of the first ones that I want to touch base with you on is shown here. These are what we refer to as the acini cells. And these acini cells, they are responsible for producing digestive juices. And so essentially what we're saying here is they're going to release juices that help further break down certain foods that we consume. Now, the next one that I'd like us to take a look at is the epsilon cell. Now, this epsilon cell releases a hormone that we refer to as ghrelin. And ghrelin is a unique hormone because it is responsible for stimulating the sensation of hunger. So what we're saying is that you realize or you recognize that you are hungry because this hormone is released from the pancreas. Again, we call it ghrelin. Now, the next and the last one that I'd like us to take a look at is the delta cell. And the delta cell releases a hormone that we refer to as somatostatin. And somatostatin is also known by another term. We oftentimes refer to it as GHIH. And GHIH is, or it stands for growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And its role or its function is to prevent unnatural and excessive cell growth. So let's take a look at a deeper dive as it relates to the endocrine glands and hormones that relate to the regulation of blood glucose levels. Now, here's kind of what I want us to look at for this. In this second column here, we've got the pancreatic islets, which we talked about just a moment ago. We've got the anterior pituitary gland, and we also have the adrenal gland. And so what this image shows us is that what's released from our pancreas, or the pancreatic islets, is of course insulin and glucagon. What's released from the anterior pituitary gland is our growth hormone, and what's released from the adrenal gland is epinephrine and our glucocorticoids. Now, specifically, what we're looking at here for this particular image is that insulin's role again is to lower blood glucose levels. And again, it does this by taking glucose that's in the bloodstream and transports it directly into our cells so that it can be processed for the creation of energy. So one of the first things that insulin does is that it helps glucose to enter the cells, which we mentioned just a moment ago. It's also going to help stimulate the process known as glycogenesis. And so remember that glycogenesis is again just the formation of glycogen, and that's really nothing more than a stored version of glucose. The next thing that insulin does is that it helps stimulate glucose catabolism. In other words, it helps to stimulate glucose breakdown. For glucagon, its role or its job here is to stimulate glycogenesis, which essentially takes place in the liver. And so with the term glycogenesis, again, I want you to focus in on the terms. The terms really do give us an idea about the process that's taking place. So we know that the first part of this is glycogen, and then we have the word lysis, which means breakdown. Now, the next one that we have here is growth hormone. And with growth hormone, this is going to decrease carbohydrate utilization as a fuel source. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if we decrease the use of carbohydrates as a fuel source, that essentially means that we're not using glucose enough. And so if we're not using glucose enough, that's something that is going to lead to an increase of blood glucose levels. Now, the next thing that we have here on the list is that growth hormone instead stimulates the mobilization, which just means activation, and the catabolism of fats. So here's what we're getting at. If we're not using carbohydrates as a primary fuel source, more than likely what's going to take place is that our body will utilize fats as an energy source. And so that's what we're talking about here with the use of growth hormone. Now, epinephrine, which is again released from the adrenal gland, its job here is going to be the stimulation of glycogenesis, which will take place both in the liver and in the muscle cell. So we'll make a note of that. And last but not least, our glucocorticoids, again released from the adrenal gland, they are going to stimulate protein mobilization, which again just means activation, and the process of gluconeogenesis. So here's what we're saying. In a nutshell, these processes that we just looked at here, these processes are going to help raise or increase blood glucose levels. The only hormone that's attempting to lower blood glucose levels is our insulin here. So let's take a look back at something that we had an opportunity to look at earlier in one of our previous video lessons, which is glucose metabolism. And what this image will do here for us is to give us kind of a nutshell of how glucose metabolism works in a feedback loop. Now remember that a lot of what happens in the body happens in feedback loops. And we've got two types. We've got a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. So remember that a positive feedback loop is all about continuing a certain process in the body, whereas a negative feedback loop, its job is to reverse a particular condition or process within the body. Now, as we look at this for glucose metabolism, this of course is going to be done as a negative feedback loop, and you'll see exactly why we say that here in just a second. But let's start here at the top. Let's assume that you or I have consumed a high carbohydrate meal. We can see it here. There's burgers, there's fries, and there's some fruits. These are carbohydrates, or carbs as we commonly call them. And all of those carbs are going to first be broken down into glucose. And so once they're broken down into glucose, we're going to then have the participation of the endocrine system. Specifically, the pancreas will help to release the hormone insulin. And as insulin is released from the pancreas, we can see it here by the orange circles. As it releases insulin, its job is to uptake or to grab these glucose molecules and then have them enter into the cells of the body. And so specifically, it can enter cells like our liver, our skeletal muscles, and other tissues to help create energy for the body. And so here's what happened. We started off with an influx of this high amount of glucose from the meal that we consumed, and through the process of the release of our insulin, those glucose levels decrease over time because they're being inputted or inserted into the other cells of the body. And so by the time that we're done with this particular feedback loop, then we don't have as much glucose that is within the actual bloodstream. Now, here's something that I want to share with you about the regulation of blood sugar. Our body, again, likes to keep things in balance, or there's a homeostatic balance that our body likes to maintain. Now, for blood sugar, our body likes to be at a range of between 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. And what happens is that if our body happens to go over this range, we typically refer to that as hyperglycemia. If our body's blood glucose levels go too far down, we typically refer to this as hypoglycemia. All right, now with hypoglycemia, what our body typically will do to help reverse this condition, to get it back into this normal range that we've just talked about, it's going to initiate a couple of processes to get us back to normal. It could or would initiate a process that we refer to as Glycogenesis. And so remember that glycogen is that stored form of glucose. And so if we've got that stored form of glucose, if levels are low, our body's going to take that glycogen and break it down so that we can have the influx of sugar within our bloodstream. The next one is Gluconeogenesis. And with gluconeogenesis, here's what's happening. Again, we have the formation of new glucose. And so remember that it's our fats and our proteins that are broken down, meshed together to help create a new form of sugar for the body. And so again, that would happen, or that would take place if our blood sugar levels are low. Now, if blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels are high, again, that term that we talked about just a second ago, if we've got a condition where hyperglycemia is in play, our body is going to try to do some things to regulate those high levels of blood sugar. One of the first processes that will happen here is glycogenesis. So again, we can think about it this way. If we've got too much sugar in the blood, again, our body is going to take those glucose molecules, mesh them together, and store them as glycogen. But what if there is still a continued level of high glucose in the blood? Well, from there, our body will take that glycogen and then store it in our body as fat. And if still blood glucose levels are higher than that, our body will take that excess glucose and it will try to excrete it from the body through our urine. So these are a few ways, or these are a few processes that attempt to keep our body in homeostatic balance. Again, our body likes to maintain this blood glucose level of between 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter, and our body has a plan to combat changes that go above or below these levels. So let's take a look at our next process here, and we're going to refer to this process as lipid catabolism, and specifically we give the name to this process lipolysis. And so one of the first things that I like to do is to always take a look at the name of a process and see if the name gives us any indication about what it's all about. And so if we do that, we'll see that the first part of this, lipo, specifically refers to fats or lipids, and the end portion of this term, lysis, simply means breakdown. So here's what we've got so far. Because we know that this is about the breakdown of fats, we're going to look at this process from the lens that we already have some fat within the body that's going to be broken down for the use of energy. So if we take a look at our adipose cell, which is listed here, we see that we've got fat or triglycerides that will be broken down through the process of hydrolysis. Now, as our triglycerides are broken down through hydrolysis, we're going to end up with two components. We're going to end up with glycerol, and we're also going to end up with fatty acids. Now, what's unique about these two components is that they're going to have some unique pathways that can help generate ATP for the body. And we're going to start by looking at the pathway that begins with glycerol. So let's create a numbered list here to help us walk through this particular process, again specifically looking at the breakdown of glycerol. So we'll start here. Our fat, which is our triglyceride, will be number 1. Again, for this, it is going to go through the process of hydrolysis. And so through that process of hydrolysis, one of the components that we have is glycerol. So we'll make that our second step. Now, this glycerol has the opportunity to enter the bloodstream, and we'll make this our third step here. And what you'll notice is that once we come to glycerol, we have kind of this split here. In other words, this split is going to show that glycerol can go in one of two ways. And we're going to look at the first way, and then we'll come back and take a look at the second in just a moment. Now, if glycerol continues in this first pathway that we're going to view, glycerol again is in the bloodstream, but what can happen next is that it can go into a given tissue cell. And as it goes through a given tissue cell, our glycerol can actually go through the process of glycolysis. And so if it goes through the process of glycolysis, of course, we're going to have pyruvate that is made here. So although it's not shown, let's put that here just above our acetyl coenzyme A. So let's make a note of the number of this process. So again, we've said that our glycerol has entered the bloodstream, and it's then going to enter a tissue cell. So we'll make our tissue cell the fourth step in this process. Again, that glycerol will then go through the process of glycolysis. It will become pyruvate, and after it has become pyruvate, it will then become our acetyl coenzyme A, and so we'll make that our sixth step. Now, with our acetyl coenzyme A in place, that is going to go directly into the citric acid cycle, so we'll make this step number 7. And although it's not shown here, this would continue and lead to our electron transport system, and we'll make this step number 8. So again, this is lipolysis breakdown. We've started with one component of our triglyceride, which was glycerol, and we were able to see how this went through a process that we're at least somewhat familiar with. Now, let's take just a second and look at this alternative pathway that glycerol could have taken. So let's again start with fat here. I'm going to use a different color just so that we can see a differentiation between these processes. So again, we're starting with fat. And the fat is going to go through hydrolysis, much in the same way that we showed just a moment ago. And we're still looking at the glycerol component. So again, the fat is broken down into that. So we'll make this our number 2. That glycerol then enters into the bloodstream, as we've shown before. So this will remain our third step here. And now here's where we see this alternative pathway. And so as glycerol is in the bloodstream, this time it is going to enter the liver. So we'll make this number 4. And as the glycerol has entered the liver, our glycerol can go through a process known as ketogenesis. Now, here's the part that's unique for us to talk about. This process of ketogenesis is going to be initiated when and if our body is severely lacking in the amount of glucose that's available. Now, this is something that's very common and very typical for folks who are on diets like the Atkins diet or the very famous or popular keto diet. They've essentially gotten their body to the point where they produce something that we'll talk about in a second called ketones to help provide energy for the body. And so that's why this particular process takes place. So we've gotten the process of ketogenesis that's taking place. And through this process, glycerol will be converted into acetyl coenzyme A. So we'll make this step number 5. And from our acetyl coenzyme A, that is going to be converted through a series of chemical processes into our ketone bodies. So we'll make that number 6. And now that we've got these ketone bodies that have developed because of ketogenesis, those ketones are then going to enter the bloodstream. So we'll make that step 7. And so now that those ketones have entered the bloodstream, they can enter a given tissue. They can be converted into our acetyl coenzyme A. So we'll make that step number 8. And from our acetyl coenzyme A here, that's going to go directly through the citric acid cycle. So we'll make that step number 9. And from the citric acid cycle, that is going to go directly into the electron transport system. And again, even though it's not labeled, we want to make sure that we indicate that here on our image. So this would be step number 10. So again, those two things that we just saw are the pathways for the breakdown of glycerol as relates to lipolysis. Now we've got one more that we've got to tackle, and this last process is going to show what happens to the fatty acid component of our fats when it's being broken down. So here we've again got our fat, so we'll label that as number 1. Again, it's going through the process of hydrolysis, and the component that we have here is the fatty acids. So that's step number 2. Those fatty acids then enter the bloodstream, and after they have entered the bloodstream, they too are going to enter the liver. So we'll make that step number 4. Now, when we have fatty acids, in order to help convert that into a form of energy, there is a specialized process that takes place, and we call that process beta oxidation. And so through the process of beta oxidation, our fatty acids are converted into our acetyl coenzyme A. And so we'll make that number 5. So now that we've got our acetyl coenzyme A, that too is going to go through our citric acid cycle. So we'll make that step number 6. And although again it's not shown here, after it's gone through the citric acid cycle, it is also going to enter the electron transport system. And so we'll make that step number 7. So here's what I want you to know about this particular process. And this is probably something that you're wondering about. And you're probably wondering, well, how many ATP does this process yield? And so here's the thing that I want to let you know. This process yields far more ATP than does our process of carbohydrate or glucose metabolism. This yields roughly between 80 to 100 molecules of ATP. And so this is a very rough estimate here, largely because the number of ATP that are generated can vary based on a number of factors. But for our purposes, again, I just want you to know that this creates a lot more ATP than the processes that we've had a chance to look at previously. And so that is essentially it for lipid catabolism. So let's take a look at the next thing that we've got here. We've talked a little bit about this already, but with lipogenesis, again, this is talking about the buildup of fat. And so because we've got the catabolism or the breakdown, of course, the buildup of that is possible as well. And so one of the things that we've mentioned earlier that I'll just recap here for a moment is that the foods that we eat, if we eat in excess, any food group, if we eat carbohydrates in excess, proteins in excess, fats in excess, all of those things are going to lead to the formation or the buildup of fat within the body. And so that's essentially what we're talking about here as it relates to lipogenesis. Let's take a look at protein metabolism. Now, with protein metabolism, here's a phrase that I think is super important for us to capture. In protein metabolism, anabolism is primary and catabolism is secondary. Okay? In carbohydrate and fat metabolism, the opposite is true. Catabolism is primary and anabolism is secondary. So what I'd like you to do is maybe pause the video here, and I'd like you to think for a second about what this particular statement means. So if you've had an opportunity to think about this process, here's what we're getting at. For proteins, we've already said here that anabolism is primary, and we have said that catabolism is secondary. And so what we mean by this is that we want proteins to be built up in the body more so than we want it to be broken down. So I'll write that down with you. Again, we want the buildup of proteins, and we really don't want this so much as relates to protein. But this process, the one that we're saying that we don't want as much, we're going to put an asterisk there because this can be very helpful. So here's again what we're saying. We want proteins because, as we know, proteins help make a variety of things within the body. Proteins can make enzymes. Proteins help make hormones. So we want that. Proteins help build our muscles. So again, we want that. We need that. Now with catabolism, the breakdown of our protein, we're saying that we don't necessarily want that because having it is far better. But if we're in a state where our body is not having sufficient glucose or other forms of energy, our body will take our protein and break it down to help create glucose for the body. So that's what we're getting at with that particular statement. Now, in the secondary component of this statement, we're saying that in carbohydrate and fat metabolism, that the opposite is true. Catabolism is primary and anabolism is secondary. And so what we're getting at here is that anytime it comes down to carbs and fats, we want those to be broken down because they can help produce a great amount of energy for the body. So we want that. And anabolism is second. And so we've kind of talked about this already. We don't want this as much either. And so we'll again put an asterisk here because this statement is not always true. We need all of these processes, but again, I just wanted us to focus on what our body's preference is. So that's what we're saying here as relates to our overview of protein metabolism. So as we talk about protein anabolism, here's what I want us to see. This represents essentially the process by which proteins are synthesized, or meaning how they're made by the ribosomes of our cells. And in essence, what happens is that every cell makes its own proteins and enzymes. So if we talk about protein anabolism, we're essentially talking about two processes that we've talked about previously. We're talking about transcription, and we're also talking about translation. Now, these are both very complex processes, but I do believe that we can make it easier for ourselves if we remember the beginning and the end product for both of these processes. So for transcription, we begin with a molecule of DNA, and that molecule of DNA is transformed for us into messenger RNA, or mRNA. Now for translation, we take that messenger RNA and we note here that it is converted into protein. So again, that's essentially how our bodies make protein, and therefore that's why we call it protein anabolism, because it is the building up process of proteins. So let's take a look at the next process that we have on the docket, which is protein catabolism. Now, this is a process that we've actually looked at before and have talked about, but specifically, this is a part of the process of gluconeogenesis, which takes place within the liver. Now, the reason that protein catabolism is going to happen is because, let's say, for example, someone does not have or is not getting a sufficient amount of carbohydrates within their diet, or if they've been starving or fasting for a period of time, their body is going to use existing sources to help create an immediate source of energy. So here's what we'll list for this particular process. We're going to list protein mobilization as step number 1. And so what protein mobilization means here is that our proteins are just becoming activated, and they're being activated knowing that they're going to need to be broken down to create this new source of energy. And so our proteins are going to go through the process that we've talked about previously, known as hydrolysis. And through the process of hydrolysis, our proteins are going to be broken down into their building blocks, which we call amino acids. So that will be step number 2. Now, these amino acids will then enter the bloodstream, and so we'll make that step number 3. And what we'll see here within this image is that some of these amino acids are going to go through the digestive system, and they're going to be broken down into something that we call urea. And we'll see here in just a moment that urea is generally excreted from the body through our urine. So let's go back to step 3 here for a second. The amino acids that remain in the bloodstream will then enter the liver, and so we'll make that step number 4. And as they have entered the liver, our amino acids are going to go through a process that we call deamination, and through this process, our amino acids are essentially going to end up as glucose and as urea. So we'll make that step number 5. Now, the glucose component that's been broken down, that's going to re-enter the bloodstream. So that'll be step number 6 for us. And as it re-enters the bloodstream, that can be used as an immediate source of energy. So we'll kind of make this step number 7 here to say that it can be used as energy. Now, from here, we can't forget about this urea that we saw part of our amino acid being broken down into. So that urea we'll make this step number 8 here, is going to enter the bloodstream as well. And this won't stay in the bloodstream very long. As we mentioned earlier with our amino acids, those that remain in the bloodstream will be broken down into urea. Well, the urea here is also going to ultimately exit the bloodstream and exit the body through the urinary system as a waste product. So we'll make that step number 9 here. And we'll say that this again exits as a waste product. So that completes the process of protein catabolism. So believe it or not, so far we've looked at carbohydrate metabolism, lipid metabolism, and protein metabolism. So let's take a look at one more thing that's related to all of these things together. We're going to look at So now that we've had an opportunity to understand the process of protein catabolism, let's talk a little bit more about some of our micronutrients. Now, as we talk about our micronutrients, the ones that I want us to focus on here are some of our well-known vitamins. And here's kind of our definition. Vitamins are organic molecules that are needed for normal metabolism. So even though these are micromolecules or micronutrients, they still have a very important role. They help normal metabolism do its work. And so many of these vitamins attach to enzymes and coenzymes, helping them to work together. And some of these vitamins have very unique and specific functions. So again, the 3 that we're going to look at are vitamins A, D, and E here. And I just want to give you a little bit of background on what these particular vitamins are helpful in regulating as it relates to our body processes. With vitamin A, this is something that typically helps to improve and to regulate our eyesight and our vision. So we'll jot that down as one of our components here. And the next one that we have is vitamin D. And vitamin D is very helpful as it relates to calcium regulation. And the last one that we have here is vitamin E. And that's going to be very helpful for the production of antioxidants. And so again, this is just a brief discussion on the topic, but my goal here is to help you see that vitamins, although they're considered a part of our micronutrients, they are still very helpful in a variety of things that relate to the functionality of the body. Now, let's look at minerals. Now, with minerals, these are inorganic elements or salts that are also essential for the body, and what they do is they help in fluid and ion balance of the internal environments. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in our urology section related to the kidneys, but here are some of the things that our minerals are. Our minerals are things like sodium, chloride, and potassium. And just in case you didn't know, we need these things for just about everything that takes place in the body. So we need these for muscle contractions. In other words, we need these things to help our bodies make movement possible. We need them for nerve conduction. We need them for the development of our bones. But here's what's unique about it. Having too much of this or having too little of it can be very detrimental to the body. So again, the goal here is for us to keep in mind that although these things are referred to as the micronutrients or the micromolecules, they are still very important to the functionality of the body. So let's take a look at the last part of our content for today's video lesson. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about something referred to as metabolism rates, or what we oftentimes hear called the metabolic rate. And part of this metabolic rate is something that we call the basal metabolic rate. And so I'd like to define that with you for just a moment. And what we're saying that this is the amount of energy released into the body in a given time by a process referred to as catabolism. It is essentially the energy that must be expended to accomplish various kinds of work. And while that's a pretty succinct definition, I'd like to give you a little bit more context and a little bit more clarity behind this. So for the metabolic rate, what we're saying is that this is the rate of expenditure, or this is the amount of calories used by the body under what we call resting conditions. All right, so here's what we mean by that. Here's what we mean specifically by resting conditions. This is a condition that is met when the body or when the individual is awake but resting. In other words, this is what happens when someone is lying down and they are not moving a muscle. And in addition to that, the individual is in what we call the post-absorptive state. And this post-absorptive state is when we have gone at least 12 to 19 hours after having consumed a meal, and also if we're in a comfortably warm environment. So let's take this concept of the basal metabolic rate and let's compare that to the overall picture of metabolism. Now, when we talk about the overall picture of metabolism, we have these three general categories. And the first is the one that we've talked about already, which is the basal metabolic rate. We also have something that's referred to as the thermic effect of food. And then we also have another component of our metabolism that's dedicated to physical activity. So here's the breakdown that I'd like to give you percentage-wise as it relates to each of these three things, and then we'll provide a little bit of a definition to each of these just so you've got better clarity. So again, when we talk about this process for the total metabolic rate, again, that first part is the basal metabolic rate, and this accounts for roughly 70% of our total metabolism. In other words, 70% of our metabolism is dedicated towards our body functioning as if we were at rest. So let me add to that for a moment. Your basal metabolic rate is the amount of calories or the amount of energies that your body needs to operate on a normal day-to-day basis. Again, considering that your body is in complete resting conditions. Now, the second portion, the thermic effect of food, this accounts for roughly 10% of our total metabolism. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's another name that we oftentimes use to refer to this. But this is the amount of energy that it requires for our body to simply digest food. So that process doesn't just happen. Our body uses energy to essentially make energy. Now, the last part is, I'm sure you can guess, the physical activity component. This makes up about 20% of our total metabolic rate. So again, our 70% is the basal metabolic rate. Our 20% again is the physical activity component. And the 10%, here's the other term that we were talking about earlier, is oftentimes referred to as Thermogenesis. All right, so those are the three primary types of things that we consider as it relates to our metabolism. Now, one of the things that's very helpful for a lot of folks who are trying to engage in weight loss or to monitor their weight and things of that nature is to calculate their basal metabolic rate. And so I'm going to show you a process here that can help you get an estimate of your basal metabolic rate. In other words, it's an estimate of how many calories your body needs just to operate the normal components of your body. So with this, I want to let you know that there are other ways, better ways than what we're doing, more sophisticated ways. But again, this is a way to just give us an estimate. So let's imagine that we've got someone who is, let's say, 5'8". Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to convert their height to inches. So this is our first step. And so someone who is in the 5 foot range or 5 feet is 60 inches. So we know that they'll at least have those 60 inches. And since we know that we've got 8 inches remaining here, we'll say that this person is 68 inches tall. So we've got our 5'8", and we'll put 68 inches right underneath that. Now, the next step here is to multiply someone's height by 2.5 to determine their height in centimeters. Okay, so we've got their height in inches, which was again 68 inches. And what we're going to do is multiply that by 2.5. Okay, and if we do the math here, we'll end up getting 170 centimeters. Okay, so good. Now, the next thing that we'd have to do is we'd have to take the individual's weight. Step 3, we're going to take their weight and we're going to convert it into kilograms. And the way we do that is to take their weight in pounds and divide it by 2.2. So let's imagine that this particular individual weighs about 200 pounds. So we'll have our 200 here, and again this is being divided by 2.2, and once we do this we'll get 90.9 kilograms. Alright, so now that we've gotten all of the components that we need, we can take these measures, place them on the graph to help us get again an estimate of this individual's basal metabolic rate. So let's do this. Let's find this individual's height on the far left side of the graph here. So here's the height in centimeters, and we know that the height for this individual is right at 170. So we're going to place a dot right on that particular line there. All right, now here's the next thing. We need to find their weight in kilograms. And so we've got their weight here, which is right at 90.9. And so we're going to follow this to 90, since that's very close to the number that we have. We'll place a dot right here. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to try and align these two dots together. And so if we do that, we'll see that we end up right about here where you see the pin light. So we'll put a dot right there to show where those numbers meet. All right, so that particular point is right at about 2.0. Now, this 2.0 here is what we refer to as our square meters. Okay, so if we circle that, we've got our 2.0. That's our square meters. So here's what we do next. We're going to go down to the chart below, and we're going to look for this individual's age. And let's imagine that this guy is between 20 to 30 years old, and the value that we see here for a male is 39.5. And this 39.5 essentially relates to the number of calories that this person would typically burn in an hour's time. Okay, so we're going to put that number in the space here, which is again going to be 39.5. And so what we found earlier is that the square meters here for this particular individual was 2.0. So we'll put that right here in the next spot. And we're going to take these numbers and multiply them together. So we'll take 39.5 times 2.0 times 24. And what this will give us in value is 1,896. And we'll put K/cal here to identify the number of calories. So here's how people use this information practically. This individual could say, well, because my body is going to burn 1,896 calories per day, if I consume more than this amount in a day, it's likely that I'm going to gain weight, especially if I'm not doing all the things that I should be doing as far as my physical activity level. And if I'm still not doing those things, and if I consume this amount of calories or less per day, it's likely that I'll end up losing some amount of weight. So again, that's how folks use this particular number from a very practical standpoint. So that concludes our discussion on the metabolism of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. I hope this has been helpful for you, and please let me know if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns.